Okay, I'll admit it. I hold my hands up. I love Apple products. They are beautifully designed and are built with an unrivaled attention to detail. And they all just work so well together in Apple's ecosystem. This makes them extremely desirable for anybody that uses Apple software, such as Logic Pro to make music or Final Cut Pro to make videos. And for many of us, when Apple releases a new product that's designed from the ground up to complement and work well with the products in their existing ecosystem, like a monitor for example, going with the Apple version of that product is usually the default option for many of us, because it's usually the best one, and most of the time, it's worth paying that little bit extra to get the very best. But every now and again, Apple releases a product that makes you think twice about parting with your hard-earned cash. And Apple Studio Display is one of those products. Priced at $15.99 US or $14.99 British pounds, Apple Studio Display, on paper at least, has a spec sheet that leaves you scratching your head in 2024. How can a monitor that has the same specs as a 7-year-old LG ultrafine 5K display be priced at $15.99 US in 2024? It just doesn't make sense. As part of doing the prep for this video, I actually rewatched MKBHD's review of the Apple Studio Display, which is 2 years old at the time of making this video, by the way. And not only did he compare it to that now 7-year-old LG ultrafine 5K display, but he also compared it to a 4K Dell monitor that at the time was priced at almost a third of the price of the Apple Studio Display. Yes, it had a 4K panel and not a 5K panel, but nearly all of the other specs were identical. However, the Dell did have some flaws that at the time would have been a deal breaker for many of us Apple users. The questionable build quality, the utilitarian design with that horrible corporate Dell logo plastered on the front of the monitor screen, not to mention the not so bright low contrast IPS panel. It just didn't cut the mustard. However, since then, Dell has come out with a new upgraded version of that monitor, imaginatively called the U2723QE. And this monitor, well, I think this might just be the perfect affordable alternative to the Apple Studio Display in 2024, especially for the everyday creator. Let me tell you why. Okay, so I wanted to cover the pricing first, for the simple reason that it is vast. And I want you to have that price in the back of your mind when we go through the key differences between these two monitors, because it might shock you. So, in 2024, Apple Studio Display is priced at $14.99 in the UK and $15.99 in the US. So, 2 years after its release, and the price remains the same. I recently purchased the Dell U2723QE off of Amazon here in the UK, and it's actually on offer at the moment at £450. And I think it's also selling in the US for a similar price around the $470 mark. So over $1,000 more for the Apple Studio Display. But what more do you actually get for that money in 2024? Let's go through this. Let's start with the display itself. Both are 27 inches, both are IPS LCD panels. However, the new Dell does come with IPS black technology, which means it has a higher 2000:1 contrast ratio versus the 1000:1 on the Apple Studio Display, resulting in much deeper blacks that you typically find on OLED panels. For me, the main drawback between IPS panels and OLED are those washed out blacks. And a lot of the time on IPS panels, the blacks do appear sort of a dark grey instead. So it's great to see that Dell has addressed this. And the result? Well, better blacks on the Dell than on the Apple Studio Display. Both monitors have a 60Hz refresh rate, both have P3 color. The Studio Display does get a little bit brighter at 600 nits versus 400 nits on the Dell, but unless you plan to take your monitor outside to work in the sun, the difference is not really notable. The only real notable difference worth talking about is that the Dell has a 4K panel and not a 5K panel that you get on the Studio Display. Now we get into that old chestnut of macOS scaling. Essentially, the reason why the Studio Display has a 5K panel and not a 4K panel is because macOS is optimized for use with monitors that have a pixel density of 110 or 220 pixels per inch, which is 1440p by 720p, which gives you 110 pixels per inch, or double that to get your 5K resolution at 5120 by 2880, and that gives you 220 pixels per inch. So what does this actually mean when you use macOS on a 4K screen? Well, it means your image could appear a little bit blurry, dependent on the scaling that you choose in the settings. Now, I've tried all of these settings, and trust me, there is no blur. Not unless you have your eyes literally pressed to the screen. From a normal viewing distance, honestly, there's no issue at all. So when it comes to the specs of both of the panels on these monitors, the bottom line for me is, unless you're a professional cinematographer or photo editor that requires a best-in-class, super color accurate and precise screen to do your work on, then the display on the Dell is more than good enough for most, if not all, of your creative endeavors. Now, there is one other key difference between these two panels, and that is the type of finish that you can get on them. The Dell monitor comes with a matte finish as standard. In other words, you cannot get a glossy finish on the Dell monitor. Now, Apple's version of this matte finish, which they're calling the Nano Texture Finish, will cost you an additional $250, which again, for the life of me, I can't understand why it's an extra $250. So when you compare like for like and you go for the matte option on both monitors, the Dell is almost $1,250 cheaper than the Studio Display. Just mad. Now, obviously not everybody does enjoy looking at a matte finish, so if a matte display is a deal breaker for you, then you may want to consider the Studio Display or some alternatives. For me personally, I do love the look of the glossy finish, although the matte finish is definitely easier on the eyes, especially for long working periods staring at a screen. So if you do go for the matte Dell option, I think your eyes will thank you. Okay, so let's talk design and build quality, because this is something that we Apple users care about deeply. So, the Apple Studio Display. Obviously, this monitor is built with the most premium of materials. It looks and feels $1 million. But does that actually matter when we're talking about a monitor? I mean, it's a monitor. It just sits there. You don't actually touch or interact with it. So let's compare this to the Dell monitor. The first thing to note here is the extremely thin bezels and minimalist design. Unlike the previous version of this monitor, there is no branding on the front of the screen at all, and the bezels are super thin, although Dell's rather hideous corporate logo does feature on the stand included in the box. But at least they didn't put it on the screen this time around. However, when we look at the Dell monitor from the back, this is when things get predictably utilitarian. Everything is made from this white plastic, although it does feel like high quality, sturdy and durable plastic to me. And what this monitor leaves to be desired in an attractive backside, it makes up for in its sheer convenience. In terms of connectivity, you effectively get a USB hub built straight into the back of this monitor. The number of ports on this thing is kind of insane. You get a HDMI port, 2 display ports, 4 USB-A ports, a headphone jack, an Ethernet port, and 3 USB-C ports. One of these being able to supply 90 watts of power straight to your Mac, all whilst driving the display. So just like with the Apple Studio, you get a 1 cable setup with the Dell also. So how does this compare to the Apple Studio Display? Well, Apple gives you 4 USB-C ports, one of them being a Thunderbolt port for power, and that's it. So you do get significantly more with the Dell U2723QE. I think we can safely say that Dell takes the win when it comes to connectivity. Okay, that's all well and good, but what other features should we consider? Well, Dell's monitor has no webcam or speakers, so you have to buy those separately. But let's be really honest with ourselves here. Does this actually matter for the everyday home studio creator? Well, if you're creating music or video, you will likely be in the market for a good set of studio monitors anyway, and that's if you don't own a pair already. And as far as webcams go, well, Apple does have a reputation of putting potato cameras in their Macs, and it's a case of more of the same here on the Studio Display. I think unless you're absolutely in love with Apple's center stage feature, you're really not losing anything by purchasing a dedicated webcam. If anything, it gives you the flexibility to invest in a really good one. And ever since Apple announced their $1,000 stand for their Pro Display XDR monitor, Apple's monitor stands have been a sore talking point ever since. Thankfully, with the Studio Display, you do get one in the box. Is that really what it's come to in 2024? We're commending Apple for including a stand in the box. Jesus. It is only a tilt adjustable stand though. If you want a height adjustable stand, oh, well that'll set you back another £300. So genuinely, if you want to be able to adjust the height of your monitor, it's an additional £300. What a world we live in. Thankfully, Dell's monitor gives you all of that functionality straight out of the box, as well as the ability for portrait mode for any of you photographers out there. So Dell wins this one comfortably also. One final thing to note though is that Apple Studio Display does have True Tone. But again, if you're doing any photography or videography work, chances are you want that feature switched off anyway, because you want a color accurate screen to work with. So another issue I have with the pricing of Apple Studio Display is when it comes to the VESA mount option. It's the same price as the tilt adjustable stand option for some reason. Not sure why, but it is. And the other drawback of going with the VESA mount option versus the stand option is that it does cover up the Apple logo, which I know is a very minimal point, but it just doesn't look very good. Part of the whole reason we buy Apple products is because of the exceptional design, so who can blame me for wanting to show it off? I found a VESA mount option on Amazon for £24, and the great thing about the Dell monitor is that it comes with the screws for the VESA mount included in the box. So setting up the VESA mount option was easy as peas, took about 5 minutes. And it does the job perfectly. So far, this setup leaves me with over £1,000 to spare, having spent £475 on both the Dell monitor and the VESA mount arm. Mad. So the final point that I wanted to make, and this one does go to the Apple Studio Display, is the integration with macOS. Like I said at the beginning of this video, it's all about the attention to detail. It's the small things, like when you have your Mac plugged into the Apple Studio Display, the volume and brightness buttons on your Mac just work seamlessly with the screen and the speakers on the Studio Display. Everything kind of just works as expected. Now, we're not going to get that level of integration on a non-Apple product, but again, does that really matter? For me personally, no. Not when we're talking about a monitor. I mean, sure, it's a nice to have, but it's really not an essential part of the experience for me. I mean, how often do you actually change the brightness on your display? I mean, it's hardly that much of an inconvenience to just reach behind the Dell monitor and adjust the brightness yourself. So, having considered all of this, what's the verdict? Well, when you stop to consider the Apple Studio Display as a full package, its seamless integration with macOS, its 5K panel, and its, let's be honest, underwhelming 60Hz refresh rate, you realise that Apple's target audience with the Apple Studio Display is the modern creator. It's likely for people like you, and it's certainly for people like me. We may not be Hollywood cinematographers, but for many of us, this kind of thing is either a serious hobby, or our livelihood, or somewhere in between. My point is, the Apple Studio Display is aimed at general creators, and it is a fantastic product for general creators. But dependent on where you are in that spectrum of a serious hobby to livelihood / day job, you may or may not want to spend almost $1,600 on a monitor. For me, the Dell U2723QE is a very sensible alternative, and it leaves you with $1,000 in hand to spend on other parts of your setup. $1,000, just think about it, $1,000 can go a long way in improving lots of other aspects of your setup, like a good audio interface, a new microphone, or even a set of studio monitors. Food for thought, as they say. Do drop this video a like if you found it helpful, subscribe if you're new, and I will see you in the next one. I've gone all in for this round.